my concentration is in literature, so this is a little bit outside of my realm. How many literature, humanities area people do we have here today? Okay, good. Anyone concentrate in philosophy or history of ideas? Okay, that's very good for me. This is, I think a lot of us have that. We have the area that we, as you're selecting the papers, maybe you're going to focus on for your final project. You have a couple that are like really good, really solid, and you have one that's like pretty far out there. Maybe you think this doesn't quite make the cut. You know what I'm saying? This is that paper. This is the one I'm really excited about, but it's just very raw. So I thought I'd bring it here to raw today. All right, toward a Dōgenian reading of Hölderlin. Who the hell are these people? That's the first question. Okay, so we all know Martin Heidegger, foremost philosopher of the 20th century, very important fellow. Friedrich Hölderlin, and I'm not good at pronouncing his German name. Dr. Schulte calls me on it every single time. So out of respect for this poet who I really admire, I'm just going to call him Fred from now on. I'm actually much better with the Asian languages. So Dogen is a Japanese Zen monk. But he's a philosopher in his own right, and we're going to look at how Heidegger's preeminent work, Being and Time, relates to Dogen's very prominent essay called Being Time, and then what this poet has to do with it. And I should probably point out, whenever we talk about Heidegger, it's probably just good to note that one of the faces on this slide is a Nazi. You could probably guess which one from the mustache, but I hate that I even had to say this in the year 2018, but that's a bad thing. So anyway, just to I don't want to look over that fact. Being in Time. Probably most of you are familiar with this. If you haven't read it, you're somewhat familiar with the idea. So let's just skip straight to Being Time. When you have a work like Being in Time and a work like Being Time, it just makes sense to compare them. These two philosophers are, separated by time and by distance and by philosophies. I mean, Dogen is from a completely different metaphysical background than Heidegger, but the similarities are striking. So this is a quote from Being Time, and I'm just going to read it, and then we're going to break it apart. Because my concentration is literature, this is actually literary criticism. It just looks like it's about philosophy. It's not really. Okay. Every object, every living thing is the whole world, even though it itself does not realize it. As there is no other time than this, every being time is the whole of time. One blade of grass, every single object is time. Each point of time includes every being and every world. Let that sink in for a minute. You'll never mow the grass the same way after reading Dōgenian. Okay, let's break it down. So every living thing is the whole world. Anything equals everything. All right? Next part. Every being time is the whole of time. So 9 or 10 o'clock a.m. on Saturday morning is every time. Any time is every time. So far, so good. We're hanging in there. But then he throws a spanner in the works. Each point of time includes every being. Okay, now we're in big trouble. And our equal signs don't work anymore. We had to change the formula. So now, anything equals every time, and any time equals everything. So, since you all have probably had you're somewhat familiar with Heidegger and Being in Time, this is like, you're saying, okay, this is interesting. You've got this, 12th century monk who's saying something very similar to what Heidegger will articulate in the 20th century, and there's a whole field of study about, how Eastern philosophy may have influenced Heidegger and how he somewhat independently arrived at some of these ideas. And there's some important contrast, but there's also some very interesting similarities. There's the arrow key. Okay, so there's a lot of literature about connecting these two. This isn't anything new. But as I was showing this to someone earlier, their reaction was, that's really weird. That's messed up. Everything is any time and any time is everything. Like, that just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense to us because we are immersed in this Aristotelian definition of time, which goes something like this: the numerical expression of movement in respect to before and after. That is not anything equals every time and every time equals anything. That is something very different and very logical. And that is precisely the reason why Heidegger's favorite poet is Friedrich Hölderlin. And there's a ton of, actually, Heidegger himself did a lot of criticism of this poet. So we have entire volumes and lectures of Heidegger lecturing on Fred's poetry. And it's very interesting because we can see get a whole new insight into his philosophies. We get to look at his philosophies being applied to poetry. And the reason he loves this poetry in general, but in particular this poet, is because it helps him get around that Aristotelian logical definition of time. It takes us from logic to poetry. So we have this quote, think about this, coming from the foremost philosopher of the 20th century, for him to say, what is needed in the present world crisis is less philosophy. That's pretty interesting. Why, if we need less philosophy, what do we need more of? We need more of real thinking. He tells us how to think when he talks about poetry. When we follow in thought Hölderlin's poetic statement, we come nearer to thinking the same as what the poet composes in his poem. This is an idea that Heidegger refers to throughout his writings as poetic dwelling. But it's thinking poetically. I'm going backward. When we see something like this, it sounds very nice. It is very poetic. We could say it's very poetic. It's not logical. So we have, as I just mentioned, there's a lot of literature connecting Heidegger to Hölderlin. But what I was wondering was, well, if Dōgen and Heidegger are connected, there's plenty of criticism there, and Hölderlin and Heidegger are connected, and there's a lot of text about that, it would really be interesting to know what Dōgen said about Hölderlin. Unfortunately, we don't know because he lived several hundred years earlier. So what I wanted to do is see if I could reconstruct or synthesize a reading as if Dōgen, from his philosophy, was reading Hölderlin. And I had to do that by using Heidegger as the bridge. So I'm going to show you what we did here. This is a text from Being Time. And what I did was look at the terms that were being discussed in literature and Dōgen, and then I scanned, thank God for ebooks, scanned the text of Hölderlin's poems to find examples of where the same terms may be being used. So at those points, we can bring in all of Heidegger's criticism, and we can bring in all the literature about these two other philosophers. So kind of constructing a bridge. One of the terms we'll go into today is at one time. At one time. At one time. At one time, I waded through the river, and at one time, crossed the mountain. You may think that the mountain and the river are things of the past, that I have left them behind and am now living in this palatial building. So at one time. This is the Japanese word that's being used there in the original. Amazingly, Dōgen did not know English in 12th century Japan. But anyway, thankfully there's people who translated this for us. So these words, there's two words here, aru, toki. It just means at one time. This word here, you can actually see just an interesting little tidbit. This radical is a pictograph of the sun. So obviously we can see how the sun is really important in telling time. So this is like, means like having something. It means to have. So the verb to have, its relation to, like in English, our verb to be. At one time, there is time. Sometimes. It could be another way to translate that. But if these words in Japanese, these two words are read as one word, it's a totally different word. They can be read independently as two different words or as a combined word, which is uji. And uji would be a little bit like adding a hyphen between at and one. At one time. So now at one becomes an adjective that describes time. The at one time. And that's also the name of his essay, Being Time. Uji. So in a lot of literature on Zen, they will talk about uji. That's what they mean, at one time. Okay. So now I thought, let's go back. Let's read some of Fred's poetry. Let's see if he ever says at one time. And let's add a hyphen and see what that does. So here is a poem named, I love the title of this poem, At One Time I Questioned the Muse. The first line is, at one time I questioned the muse. At one time I questioned the muse, and she replied to me, in the end, you will find it. Beautiful poem. I really encourage you to check out this poet. But this is an Dōgenian reading of this poem. Now, let's do a Dōgenian reading of the poem. At one time, I questioned the muse, and she replied to me, in the end, you'll find it. This changes the meaning a little bit. You know, I think when we talk about at one time, arutoki, we're always drawing a distinction between past and present. When I say at one time I crossed a river, you know I'm not talking about now. So I'm telling you there's a past event and there's a present event and they're different. Whereas when we say at one time, now past, present, and future are all coming together in a single moment. And it oddly makes a lot of sense in the context of this stanza. In the end, you'll find it. Now in the end could mean something completely different. Let's look at another, and look at this. Happy coincidence. It's always good when you're doing scholarly work and you take a little bit of a leap and then you keep reading and it actually like plays out in the rest of the text. I'm reading through this poem and I come along this later line of the poem. Beginning and end greatly deceive us. Probably would have been a better title to this talk. Beginning and end greatly deceive us. Note to self. Okay, here's another poem. Between day and night, something true must once appear. Once, the German here, the original German, Einsmals. If you speak German, I'm very sorry. I really respect that language, but like I said, my expertise is in the Asian languages and not in the European languages. Once, one time, all together at once, is this idea that like it happened once. One time it happened. So this is very similar to arutoki. Let's read it with uji. Between day and night, something true must at one time appear. Now day and night are not so much separated, but they're overlapping. What is the difference between day and night? What is the difference between when I crossed the river and when I crossed the mountain and now me being in this palatial Eric Johnson building? So we've connected the philosophers and the poets. What do we do with this? So real quick, just wrap this up. We've got this guy hanging over us, this Aristotelian definition of time. We've got to deal with that. It sort of gives us this image of a line with dots or a string with beads. And there's always, whenever philosophers look at this, they always kind of end up with there's two different times. You've got this durational time, is what I'm calling it, and then you've got these moments. The time that just keeps going and the times that stand still. the memories, the festival, the holiday is like a really important term in Heidegger. In holidays, like, things are different. You can wear different clothes. You can do different things. You can wake up late. The normal rules don't apply to these moments. So there's two different versions of time, or visions of time, or views of time. And Dogen recognizes this. He says the moments of the past and the present do not pile up. As this string of time piles up, it forms these balls, right? So this is our moments. Nor do they line up side by side, ongoing, chronological, durationally. But it's important to note that he is negating both of these. So he's acknowledging these same aspects of time that we see in Western philosophy, but he's also negating them. Time does not pile up. Time does not line up. But the operational word there is nor. He is not saying that this one and this one are neither of them time. He's saying neither this nor this is time, which I think is very important. He is not offering up a different, unconsidered, yet undiscovered definition of time, but saying it's both of these at the same time, at one time. And that is probably what we can only consider poetically. Logically, you can't be two contradictory things at the same time, the law of non-contradiction. But poetically, we can contradict. And so I think what this opens up to us, and what Heidegger, proposes, that we should think about things not logically, not philosophically, but poetically. And that doesn't just mean poetry. That means philosophy and literature and maybe even science and other areas. So I'll just leave you with a quote from this amazing poet, which I think has a little bit even more significance now that we've had this little talk. Long is the time, yet what is true comes to pass. Thank you.